In the year 1347, in a forgotten corner of a rain-soaked valley in the heart of Anglia, there lived a woman named Elwyn. She was no queen, no noble, nor even a scribe whose name might be scratched into the annals of time. She was a weaver, her hands calloused from years at the loom, her fingers stained with the ochre and woad of her dyes. Yet, in the village of Thornwick, where the mud clung to boots and the air carried the scent of peat and despair, Elwyn was a quiet legend, a woman who wove not just cloth, but stories, secrets, and something that felt dangerously close to hope. The village of Thornwick was a place where the sun seemed to forget to shine. Its wooden huts huddled together like frightened sheep, their thatched roofs sagging under the weight of endless rain. The church, a squat stone structure with a bell that clanged like a warning, stood at the village's heart, its shadow long and unyielding. The villagers lived by the rhythm of its tolls: prayer at dawn, prayer at noon, prayer at dusk. To miss a single one was to invite whispers of sin, and in Thornwick, whispers were as dangerous as blades. Elwyn's life began as most did, in a cradle of straw surrounded by the bleating of goats and the low murmur of her mother's prayers. Her father, a plowman, had died before her first winter, crushed beneath an ox cart when the wheel splintered on a frost-hardened rut. Her mother, gaunt and tireless, raised Elwyn and her three brothers on pottage and promises of heaven. By the time Elwyn was 10, she was already at the loom, her small hands learning the rhythm of warp and weft, her eyes tracing the patterns her mother taught her, patterns that told of rivers and stars, of wolves and saints, of a time before the world was so heavy with suffering. But Elwyn was different. Where her mother wove for survival, Elwyn wove for something else. She saw the world not as it was, muddy, brutal, and fleeting, but as it could be. In her tapestries, the threads became rivers of fire, forests of emerald, and skies that burned with the colors of a dawn she had never seen. The villagers noticed. They whispered that her work held a kind of magic, though they crossed themselves when they said it. The priest, Father Godric, watched her with narrowed eyes, his sermons growing sharper with warnings of vanity and witchcraft. By her 20th year, Elwyn was known beyond Thornwick. Her tapestries, bartered for grain or wool, had reached the halls of minor lords, their colors catching the flickering light of their hearths. But fame, even small, was a dangerous thing in the Middle Ages. It drew eyes of envy, of suspicion, of hunger. And it was in the autumn of 1347, when the first whispers of a great pestilence reached the valley, that Elwyn's life began to unravel like a poorly knotted thread. The pestilence came not with trumpets or armies, but with silence. Travelers stopped arriving at Thornwick's muddy crossroads. The market square, once alive with the clatter of carts and the shouts of peddlers, grew still. Then the first villager fell ill, a tanner named Adric, whose cough turned to blood and whose skin bloomed with black sores. Within days he was dead, his body wrapped in a shroud and buried in a shallow grave outside the churchyard, for Father Godric declared the sickness a punishment from God. Soon others followed: the baker's wife, the miller's son, Elwyn's youngest brother, Cynric, who had always been too frail for the fields. Elwyn watched as her village became a graveyard. She worked by candlelight, her loom a refuge from the wails outside her door. Her latest tapestry was her most ambitious yet, a scene of a great tree, its roots plunging into the earth, its branches reaching for a sky of crimson and gold. She wove into it every story she had ever heard, of saints who walked with wolves, of stars that sang to shepherds, of a time before the world was so heavy with suffering. She did not know why she wove it, only that it felt necessary, as if the act of creation could hold back the darkness creeping into Thornwick. But the darkness would not be held at bay. One night, as the church bell tolled for yet another soul, a knock came at Elwyn's door. It was Hilda, the midwife, her face pale and her hands trembling. "They're burning the dead now," she whispered. "Father Godric says it's the only way to cleanse the sin. But Aylwyn, they're looking at you. They say your tapestries brought the sickness. They say you've angered God." Aylwyn's heart sank, but her face remained steady. She had heard the whispers before, how her colors were too bright, her patterns too strange, her solitude too unnatural for a woman of her age. She had no husband, no children, only her loom and her dreams. In a village where survival demanded conformity, Elwyn was a thread that refused to blend.
"They'll come for you," Hilda warned. "Leave, Aylwyn, take your tapestries and go." But Aylwyn could not leave. Her mother was bedridden, her remaining brothers too weak to flee. And there was the tapestry, unfinished, its crimson threads calling to her like a half-remembered prayer. She shook her head. "I'll stay," she said. "If God is angry, let him speak to me himself." The next day, the villagers gathered in the square. Father Godric stood before them, his voice thundering with righteous fury. "The pestilence is God's judgment," he cried. "We have harbored a sinner among us, one who weaves blasphemy into her cloth, who defies the natural order with her unnatural art." The crowd murmured, their fear twisting into anger. Aylwyn stood at the edge of the square, her hands clasped tightly, her eyes fixed on the priest. She did not speak. She did not need to. The tapestry in her hut spoke for her, its colors brighter than any sermon. They came for her at dusk. A mob of men, their faces gaunt with hunger and fear, dragged her from her home. Her mother's cries echoed behind her as they bound her hands with coarse rope and led her to the church. There, in the flickering light of torches, Father Godric pronounced her fate, trial by ordeal. If she was innocent, God would spare her. If guilty, the fire would claim her. They built a pyre in the square, its wood damp from the endless rain. Aylwyn stood before it, her wool tunic heavy with mud, her hair loose and wild. She did not beg or weep. Instead, she looked at the crowd, her neighbors, her kin, the people she had woven for, and saw not hatred, but fear. They were afraid of the pestilence, of God, of her. And in that moment, she understood something. Her tapestries had not brought the sickness, but they had given the village something to blame, something to burn besides their own despair. As they tied her to the stake, Aylwyn closed her eyes and thought of her tapestry. She saw the tree, its roots deep in the earth, its branches reaching for the stars. She saw the crimson sky, the color of blood, of sacrifice, of rebirth. And she saw herself not as a weaver or a sinner, but as a thread in a larger pattern, one that stretched beyond Thornwick, beyond the pestilence, beyond the fire. The flames began to rise, licking at the hem of her tunic. The crowd was silent now, their anger spent, their eyes wide with something like awe. Aylwin did not scream, she did not pray. Instead, she whispered a single word, a name she had given to the tree in her tapestry. Eadwulf. It was the name of the first story her mother had told her, of a wolf who carried the sun across the sky each night, guarding the world until dawn. The fire roared, and Aylwin was gone. But the story did not end there. Days later, when the ashes had cooled and the pestilence had begun to ebb, a peddler arrived in Thornwick. He carried with him a bundle of cloth, wrapped in sacking, its edges singed, but its colors still bright. It was Aylwin's tapestry, salvaged from her hut by Hilda before the mob could destroy it. The peddler bartered it to a merchant, who sold it to a lord, who hung it in his hall. And there, in the flickering light of a hearth, the tapestry told its story. Of a tree that grew from ashes, of a sky that burned with hope, of a woman who wove her soul into the world. Years passed, and the tapestry traveled. It hung in castles and monasteries, its colors fading but never dimming. Monks copied its patterns, weaving them into manuscripts. Nobles spoke of it in hushed tones, calling it the work of a saint or a sorceress. And in the villages, where the pestilence had left only ghosts, they told stories of Aylwin, the weaver who defied the fire, whose threads held the world together. No one knew her name, not truly. The tapestry bore no signature, no glyph to mark its maker. But it did not need one. Like the Red Queen of Palenque, Aylwin's legacy was not in words, but in what she left behind. A vision of a world where beauty could rise from pain, where a single thread could outlast 1,000 flames. In the end, Aylwin was not forgotten. She was woven into the earth, into the stories, into the crimson sky that burned above Thornwick long after her ashes had scattered. Her tapestry, like her life, was a testament to the stubbornness of the human spirit, a reminder that even in the darkest of times there are those who weave light into the shadows. And so, in the quiet of the night, when the church bell no longer tolled and the rain had finally ceased, the stars above Thornwick seemed to shine a little brighter, as if carrying the light of a weaver who had never truly left.